I'm Wayne Henderson. We're here in Rugby, Virginia, and I'm a luthier, and that's a sort of fancy word. I always thought it's for a guitar builder. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've been doing for 50-some years probably, and it's what I like doing, and I've been, even when I had other jobs carrying the mail and stuff like that, I still worked in my shop and built guitars almost every day of my life.
Wow.
And I've always been into that.
Were you born in this area?
Yeah, I was raised right here in this same community.
And this is
where we are now.
This is Grayson County?
It's Grayson County, and this community right here is called Rugby.
Okay.
I don't reckon it got anything to do I know of with British football, but or the rugby game or whatever that is.
Right.
And I've always lived right here, and it's it's real close by North Carolina, and not far from Tennessee either.
Right.
Down the corner of Virginia, and it's always been a hotbed for old time music, and might be one reason I was into that, just because of the community.
Right.
Here, you can go any direction, not very far, you can find all kinds of musicians.
Right.
And the most of them grew up doing that, the ones that are still around and stuff.
What are your earliest memories of music?
I guess my dad was an old-time fiddle player.
Okay.
And I can remember him playing on that fiddle as far back as I can remember anything.
Okay.
When I was just a small kid. And he, like most of the old-time musicians around here, when they started raising a family, they sort of quit playing music, or the music was just a hobby. Mm-hmm. Then they'd do it for fun. Mm-hmm. But they just about had to, even sort of like it is now, it's pretty hard to make a living playing music.
Right.
And I don't hardly know of any of them around here. My music heroes from my childhood, some of them that played so good and so great players, I don't know hardly any of them that made a living playing music.
So they always had some other kind of job, or they were farmers or something like that?
They were farmers or did some other kind of job.
Right.
E.C. Ball that lived right in this community, he's one of my influences as far as a guitar player, a thumb picker, guitar player, lived right in this community, and he was so good that I believe he could have been played anywhere. He at least should have been Doc Watson's level or something like that.
Right.
And he drove the school bus and ran the community store, but he played music every weekend, and he later on played gospel music a lot, played every Sunday, and had radio shows in Galax and Jefferson and Marion. And
oh, wow.
And, he was a busy musician.
Right.
And played with all kinds of people and everybody. But he still, mostly all he ever did too much was worked in the school bus and stuff. But he played music probably every day and wrote tunes and was a fantastic musician that should have been on the Grand Ole Opry or something, as far as I was concerned, or lots of other people too.
Right.
And he was he was one, and there was several others in the community just like that. And it is even back at that time when in his early career, Doc Watson just lived 40 minutes away over in Deep Gap, and he was the same thing. You'd hear tell of him going to the Fiddlers Convention and playing. They say, my buddy Albert Hash that helped me, a fiddle maker, he was a good player too. Mm-hmm. They'd go to contests, and he went to a Fiddlers Convention contest one time, and I think he had managed to beat Doc in his fiddle playing and whatever he did, and come in ahead of Doc's thing, and the prize was a bag of flour. and Albert said he sort of felt sorry for this poor old fella that was blind. Right. That couldn't see anything, and I think he won the prize, but he gave the bag of flour with the contest to him, which was probably a pretty important thing at the time.
Right.
And I remember Albert telling me that story one time. And so, people, you just have to get the right the right opportunity and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And Ralph Rensler came along and looking for Tom Ashley, but he discovered Doc was an awful good banjo player and got to sort of interested in him and had to convince him to play acoustic instruments. At the time, he was playing in Johnson City with a rockabilly band, playing a Les Paul with a fellow named Jack Williams, piano player, and played that. And Ralph Rensler told him, you need to get an acoustic guitar. This folk music right now is going to be big. Right. That's what was his vision, and he was right. Yeah. And Doc got started into that at just exactly the right time.
That would have been, the mid-'60s, right?
Yeah, early 60s.
Early 60s, right.
And Mr. Ball could have probably done the same thing if he had run into Ralph Rensler, probably. Right. And stuff like that. And, of course, Doc was a fantastic musician. Right. And could do stuff like nobody else did when he'd playing those flat-picking tunes on the guitar. Right. And nobody much done that.
Now, do you think there's something special about the area here? And I think you already touched on it a little bit, because we're at this kind of juncture of so many different states. And so tell us a little bit about the history of music in Grayson County, and you've already covered some of it. And, one of the questions I had, too, were songs from, like, Jimmie Rodgers' repertoire, was that part of the repertoire of people that people played in this area?
It sure was. Now, we had not everybody had record players. Right. But we had our family had an old Victrola, which most people did, around, had one of those old played 78 records. Right. And we had a couple of Jimmie Rodgers records, and we never didn't collect records or know too much about it. And Doc, he's told me all kinds of stories about they ordered stuff from Montgomery Ward, the catalog. Right. You got a free record sometimes, if that's what you were into. Okay. And said his mom got him every record in the world, over the years. But we had a couple of Jimmie Rodgers records. One of them was Pistol Packing Papa. Yeah. And that might have been the only Jimmie Rodgers, but I listened to it all the time. Probably wore that record out.
When your options are limited, you're going to listen to it probably more often, right?
Oh yeah. And we had a few Carter family records. Yeah. And one I listened to had one from Henry Whitter, who, I don't know if you ever heard of him or not. He's actually from Freeze, Virginia. Yeah. But he had one about the fox chase where he played the harmonica. Oh, I know. Barked and carried on, and then right on the end of it, he said, and then they caught the fox. Right.
He does all the dog barks and stuff like that.
Dog barks. Yeah. I wore that record out, too. Right. And we didn't have a lot of records, we didn't. But EC done some Jimmie Rodgers songs, and Jimmie Rodgers was immensely popular ever since the Bristol sessions or whatever, and his records sold big, and and almost everybody had them.
And he comes out of a little bit of a different tradition than, say, the Carter family, where they're kind of more based in like the mountain old time music. Oh yeah. What do you think? He had a little more of the blues and vaudeville and stuff in his music. But that still appealed to the people in this area.
Oh yeah, I think it did. It might be something that they hadn't heard much. Right. Around here now, that old time music like a Carter family played. Right. Almost every family had somebody that could play that. Right. Could play that stuff and sing those old songs and do stuff like that. But Jimmie Rodgers yodeling and those guitar licks he did was pretty fancy, Back more then, than I didn't know anybody that could do that. Really? Except Mr. Ball was a great player, but he didn't play Jimmie Rodgers licks, and that, this sort of quick single note stuff, which was sort of like what Doc got to doing later on too. Right. And I know Jimmie Rodgers was a huge influence on Doc. Right. I'm sure he probably had all of his records, Right. And
where was Riley Puckett from?
Riley Puckett played with a band. Now, he was an influence on everybody. And that's who Mr. Ball talked about all the time. Yeah. And Riley Puckett was, I think, from Georgia. But anyway, he played with the Skillet Lickers, which was a band from Georgia down there. Gid Tanner was the fiddler, and a great band, and they made records too, and that's how come people knows about them. Right. And they had he was the most amazing guitar player I'd ever heard at the time, because they must have the most old-time band, string band records that you heard, you almost didn't hear the guitar player.
Right.
And it might have been they didn't have good guitars, many of them.
Right.
But they never put the microphone close to the guitar player to hear his backup rhythm, and especially they just didn't play no lead. That was just something they didn't do too much. That was fiddles and banjos to do that. But Riley Puckett played a style of rhythm with all the runs, and he would run so far out on a limb you'd think he'd never get back. But the time he got done with that run, it would always be back perfect in rhythm and time with everything, and that just amazed everybody.
Yeah,
me too. That I'd heard that record, I couldn't figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
and Mr. Ball could do it a little bit. And that's what he told. And I've heard Doc say lots of times, he learned all kinds of stuff from Riley Puckett.
Yeah.
And that was, I don't know that anybody yet today can play just exactly like he did.
Yeah.
He was another blind fella too.
Yeah, true. What sparked your interest in instrument building originally?
Well, I think probably by, living in this community, nobody had money.
Right.
Much. Everybody was, wasn't, not poor. We had plenty of stuff to eat always and that kind of thing. But if you wanted something fancy, like a shiny new guitar that sounded good, that was just impossible.
Right.
You could have bought seemed to me like you could have bought an automobile as easy,
Right.
And I always wanted a good guitar. And the first guitar I ever had was not bad. It was an old Recording King. Mm-hmm. And it was one of EC had handed down, and stuff. And when he got his Martin, that guitar went to his sister-in-law, and then my brother bought it from her. And when I was 5 years old, I got that old guitar to bang on and started learning a few chords and started playing. But I wanted one of those Martins like EC's so bad I couldn't stand it. But there was no way me or my family could have afforded anything like that. And I grew up making toys I played with, and wooden things of everything, little slingshots or anything to roll and play with, and toys and cars and trucks. If I was even fortunate enough to get a store-bought one for Christmas or something, I always took it apart and seen how it worked, or used the wheels off of it and make my own. I just thought I had to do that with everything.
Right.
And when it got so I needed a better guitar, I thought, well, I've always made these things, and they ain't made out of nothing but wood, pretty much. I should be able to make one. And Mr. Ball wouldn't let me take the strings off of his old guitar or anything, to feel in it.
Right.
But I could draw around the outside of it and measure everything else that I could.
Okay.
And so I got really into it by that, and the first one I made worked and would play.
Right.
And then, after that, it wasn't long till, I thought, well, I should be able to make a better one.
Right.
And, the influence of the old-time music and just wanting the better instruments to play, and that's what caused me to be an instrument maker, for sure, because, and then it wasn't too long till I got my next guitar. Albert Hash was the fiddle player that my dad knew, and that's how I got sort of connected to. The first time I tried to make a guitar, I got the old rubber glue that my dad put weather stripping on his truck doors, and I slipped my mom's dresser drawer bottom out and laid it in the branch and soaked the walnut veneer off of it.
Okay.
So it was thin enough to bend. And that's how I put my first guitar together. I worked on it all summer from my school vacation when I had to farm. You had to seem like I thought had to work all the time.
Right.
But there's a little bit of time that I could go out in the back building out there where I had everything spread out and nothing but a pocket knife and a keyhole saw and a few hand tools like that to work with. And that's all I had to work with. But I got a guitar made.
Yeah.
That looked like a guitar, and it I had it put together with that old glue, and I'd looked at my old Recording King. I had it more to go by then.
Right.
And it was a pretty good looking guitar.
Yeah.
And when it got hot in August,
oh no,
that old heat set in on that old rubber glue. I went out there one day and that thing had come apart and blossomed out like a morning glory. The sides, they just totally come apart.
That had to be a disappointing day.
Yeah, that was pretty bad. And I hadn't even told my dad or anything. People thought she's crazy for trying to make a guitar.
Right.
You could make a sled or farm
right.
equipment and stuff like that, but to make a musical instrument, they thought I was afraid they thought I'd
right.
lost my mind, and my dad could tell there was something wrong with me.
Right.
And I questioned me, and I thought, well, I'd tried to make a guitar and said it all come apart.
Right.
And he was, I think he felt sorry for me a little bit, and he said, well, the next time it's a rainy day, we can't work or something, I'll take you to see Albert Hash. And my dad knew him because Albert had fixed his fiddles and stuff before. And he said, that guy, he can even make a fiddle. I mean, he's worked on my fiddle, and I think he can even make them,
Right.
And he'll probably tell you what to do, everything.
Wow.
And sure enough, went over there, and Albert turned out to be one of my heroes, you know, and he told me how to bend wood, and he gave me a piece of an old mahogany door somebody had threw out. It's really cheap wood and plywood and stuff. And he said, this is mahogany. He said, that's the same thing a Martin's made out of.
Yeah.
That about drove me wild.
Right.
But he gave me all that stuff and told me how to heat a pipe red hot and wet your wood and you can bend your sides. Mm-hmm. And see, that first one was just stuck together with the spring,
Right.
I mean, it still had all that tension. When that glue let loose, it just went everywhere. And but anyway, he told me how to bend and what kind of glue to use to get you some of that Elmer's, or sort of like Elmer's, but it's weldwood cement glue. It's just white glue. And sure enough, that guitar I still have here is still together from that day. And so that. And then I worked probably a year, to get that guitar made. Yeah. And I couldn't wait to go show it to Albert, And when I went over there, it would play. You could tune it and play it. And Albert was a very encouraging person. That helped more than almost anything else. Yeah. Almost better than any instructions he had, because he didn't know how to make guitars himself. He made beautiful fiddles.
Fiddles, right.
And but he looked at that guitar and said, Lord, son, if I'd known you'd done this good, I'd have got you some better wood. And, bragging on you like that really helps.
Yeah, the encouragement helps.
And encourages. And he got a catalog out and said, I'm going to order you I'll order you some rosewood. That's the same thing Mr. Ball's Martin's made out of,
Right.
And I couldn't wait. He ordered and got me a set of rosewood. And my number 2 guitar actually sounded pretty good. Yeah. And I got it back not too long back, and I have it in my collection.
Nice.
And so that's a pretty exciting thing. And Albert helped that, and the influence of playing music. And then when I got that guitar, I had a better guitar. I could play better and everything. And that's the music stuff encouraged me to build. And
right.
And I sold that guitar for $40 and a hard shell case. And I thought I'd hit the big time. Yeah. And then I took that $40 and bought me some more wood, and I've been doing that ever since.
Now, obviously, you're a fan of Martin guitars, and Martin guitars, especially in an area like this, it must have been pretty hard for somebody to buy a Martin guitar.
Oh yeah, they were almost. That Mr. Ball had that one, and he wasn't much better off than any of us. I don't know how he got that thing,
right?
But he bought it new in 1949.
Wow!
And he was a pretty prominent player, and deserved to have a nice guitar like that. And that was the only one anywhere in this community.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you could order. You referenced your Recording King. Talk about a little bit about catalog guitars and what those are, and how they reached because the guitar really, like you pointed out, kind of wasn't the primary instrument in old time music for a long time. So when the guitars became kind of more affordable, how would people get them through like these catalogs and stuff?
Well,
like
that's how they got them.
Right.
They had that Recording King got. Nowadays that name has been bought by a Chinese company.
Right.
You see them everywhere you look, but the old ones were made by Gibson, the Gibson company, and that was their lower grade thing that they did not want to put their name on, but they sold them through Montgomery Ward's, that one, and then the other Kalamazoo's. There was a sort of the same kind of deal, named after the town they were made in,
Right.
but they went to another mail order company and stuff. But that Recording King, Mr. Ball ordered that guitar from Montgomery Ward, and he said it cost $9.50.
Wow.
And it's a pretty nice old guitar, made out of mahogany and spruce. And,
Right.
And he said they had another one that cost $11.50. I believe it was a Carson Robinson.
Oh, yeah.
endorsed model,
Yep.
But said it cost $11.50, and he said he couldn't afford that.
Right.
I guess it's hard to imagine $2 being the backbreaker whether you could buy a guitar or not.
But maybe you only made $10 in a month, or something like that.
Probably so, something like that. But anyway, that's how he handed it down to his, to his sister-in-law, and then my brother bought it from her, and that's how come me to have that old Recording King guitar.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
And I played that thing till I learned how to build stuff.
Yeah. Let's talk about Martin guitars a little bit for people listening who may not know the history of Martin guitars. Let's talk about the guitars, I guess, maybe that had the biggest impact on country and old time music are those beautiful pre-war Martin guitars. Tell us what makes those guitars so special and kind of where they fit into the history of Martin guitars.
Well, I feel like at those, I think they call them Golden Age, guitars made during the 30s. And I think back at that time, Martin had their best workers that they ever had, probably, and they for certainly had the best materials. Back at that time, Brazilian rosewood was, I think they ordered that stuff in a log form to start with, went into some company that they didn't resaw it, but they went to this company and they bought it for 70 cents a pound.
Wow.
I've heard. I can't imagine buying wood by weight, Nowadays you have to buy a set of sides or back.
Right.
And they had wonderful materials, and they had the spruce that they used back in those days was Appalachian stuff, grew in this region, this in the east, anywhere from Georgia to New York.
Okay.
And the most of their spruce that they used come from New York, and they called it Adirondack spruce. But it's all just a species of spruce called red spruce.
Okay.
And it grows all over the east places, but the best of any spruce grows high on the mountain or the north side where it grows slow and has fine, close grain. And that's they had lots of that stuff. You can look at any of their old guitars, and the quality of that wood and stuff in there is just absolutely amazing.
Right.
And you find wood like that nowadays, but it's pretty scarce and far between.
Right.
And small builders like me can find usually plenty of good quality wood. But back in those, even back in 30s and 40s, they'd make 5,000 guitars a year.
Right.
And it's just hard to imagine how much wood that took to do that.
Right.
And you look at those old guitars and you look how great quality all of it was.
Right.
And they were their process of building and their selection of wood, somebody was really particular, and they didn't use anything but almost the best quality stuff that you could get. And they were just a great company Gibson was about the only other company around that made stuff, and they made great stuff too. They had, I don't think he was quite as particular about their materials and stuff as Martin was, but they're still nice guitars and good quality instruments. But Martin just made a lot of really great instruments, and some of the, they like to make fancy stuff.
Right.
they made guitars that had pearl binding on them,
Right.
and like the Jimmy Rogers guitar, that was a
Right.
special order guitar made, I think, in 1928, and
Yep.
what they called the triple aught 45, and that 45 was the style of the
Right.
guitar, and I have, in my collection here, I have 3 of those pearl bound Martins.
Wow.
And you can just look at those guitars and look at the quality of the wood, and it's just unbelievable what nice wood they could get.
Right.
But they probably had a selection and they had, I know at times they've had one person that selected wood
Right.
for them. He went through the pile. This wood's good enough, like that. And that is one reason that they always had high quality wood in their stuff. But those fancy ones, and like Jimmy Rogers was one of the first,
Right.
to be what you'd call an endorser, I
Right.
guess. Or Martin didn't normally do that.
Right.
They said their guitars is good enough. We don't have to give them to famous people
Right.
to get people to play them. But they sort of did in that case, I think, because Jimmy Rogers was huge
Right.
when it come to a country musician, and they built that guitar, I think, in 1928. And I've seen letters. I've probably got books here that's got, correspondence between him and Martin and everybody about getting that guitar.
I think even Ralph Peer was involved in that process too.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, when we're talking about the wood, how much, when you're selecting wood for a guitar, how much of it is you're looking for things that add to the tonal quality of the guitar, and how much of it is cosmetics?
Well, most of that stuff is hand in hand. Mm-hmm. The cosmetic stuff you like for a piece of wood to be nice and straight,
Right.
and even grained, especially the top. That's more important for the sound of anything for that. But rosewood or mahogany or whatever the back and sides are made out of, the nicer it's quarter sawn, and that means the grain standing straight up.
Okay.
And that takes a big tree to do that, in which
Right.
that makes the wood scarce, because there's, even back in those days, they wasn't this enormous amount of big trees big enough to make a quarter sawn piece as wide as a whole guitar.
Right.
And that good quality wood like that is pretty, like that, and it's even more important for the sound.
Right.
And how they hold up.
Right.
A nice quarter sawn board, if it lays here and the floor will stay stable, and if it's slab cut, with the grain being flat, I mean, some people call it flat sawn, as opposed to being the grain standing straight up where it's got little lines on the top like a spruce top is.
Right.
And if it's slab cut, those grains are circles looking things.
Gotcha.
Look like arrowheads or something.
Right.
And that's just the total way the board is turned when it comes out of the log.
Okay.
But it's quarter sawn wood is real stable. It's not affected by weather as much, and it don't shrink back and forth as much. Humidity change does not affect it as much.
Right.
So that's the reason and if you see all those old Martins, most of the time they selected nice quarter sawn wood, even for the back and sides.
Right.
And sometimes the sides and backs might have more flat sawn wood in it, but they would put that out toward the outside, and you could just see any of those old guitars, and you can see for certain that they selected carefully
Right.
the wood that they put in that thing. And something like those nice ones, like a Style 45, like Jimmy Rogers, something, or Gene Autry's, or
Right.
all those guys, they made nice guitars for 'em.
Right.
And they were perfectly quarter sawn, and the one that I have, I study and look at them all the time.
Yeah.
And just amazed at what good quality wood that was in those guitars like that.
Tell us a little bit about, too, how the evolution of the interior of the guitars changed from Martin, say, from that golden period before World War II, say, through like the 60s. What did the internal structure change?
Well, there's a big difference in the internal, which would mostly be the the position and the size and shape of the bracing. You know, that's something you really don't see much. You look through the sound hole of a guitar, you can see back braces.
Right.
But the important stuff up under the top, you usually can't see. And, you know, like Martin would, back in the old days, they were fewer of them out there, you know, people. And I think as music changed, you know, the people playing more, and they played louder and used heavier strings.
Right.
Those old guitars back in the 20s, early 20s and teens, and even up into the 30s, a lot of those guitars had like gut strings on them.
Yeah.
That's just all there was. That's what they had. And the bracing for those gut strings or nylon strings later on, is the tension is so low on them. And to get that sound with low tension strings, you have to make that top thin and the braces thin.
Okay.
So they vibrate easier and more.
Right.
And everything about them, I've got to handle 2 or 3 original Stradivariuses in my time.
Yeah.
And you get to looking at those things, and what I noticed more than anything else is how lightly constructed they were.
Yeah.
And how good they sound and everything. But you put modern strings on them, it'd probably be the end of it.
Right.
And but Martin guitars are the same way. And then as they making more and more of them, you know, getting up toward the 60s, like that. And like in 1944, they quit shaving the braces out thinner in the tops because people were probably using heavier strings.
Right.
And there was just getting to be more of them out there, you know. And you don't want to, and I know myself as a guitar builder, the last thing you want is that thing come back and you have to fix it.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah, and those companies were the same way.
Right.
And it was, you know, expensive for them and everything, you know, like that to do. And so they started, the best way to prevent that is make things stronger. Make it a little stronger. Of course, the stronger it's made, it doesn't quite have that sound.
Right.
You know, because that top's not going to vibrate as good as it does when the brace is real light.
Right.
And everything, unless you do have really small light gauge strings.
Right.
You know, you get by with it then. But later, the more time progressed on, you know, people, maybe music changed. They played different, played louder and harder rhythm, and acoustic guitars with, you know, some of them got to be used as lead guitars, and
Right.
to the influence of Doc Watson and people like that. Acoustic guitars got played more, but they were usually just a rhythm instrument that people played hard rhythm on.
Right.
And that would, I think, took, you know, they had to be made a little stronger. And so the best sounding guitars in the world, I think, are those old ones made back in the 30s.
Yeah.
When they had their best material, and they've always had great craftspeople that worked there.
Right.
But when those old guitars were, back at that time, they had that perfect material, and they had great workers, and they knew exactly what it took for that guitar to sound exactly right.
Right.
And one of those old guitars you have today, if it's still in really good condition, they're usually fantastic.
Right.
And sound almost better than anything you can ever hear, you know. That's
Now,
for sure.
did you, when you started building guitars and started getting more proficient, did design elements from other makers creep into your making also, or is Martin kind of the foundation of what you strive for?
Well, I've always been fascinated with those old Martin guitars and try to copy them and make stuff like them. But things like I always thought it was a good idea to put an adjustable truss rod in your neck. And because a lot of those little guitars, the neck pulls up on them, and there's not. It's a hard fix to try to fix them.
Right.
And I put that. I sort of designed me a truss rod that works good, and it don't show, and it's on the adjusts from the inside, and it's little and light. And
Right.
I didn't think could hurt, but it sure was nice to be able to tighten that thing and make sure my neck's going to stay straight.
Be able to change the relief in your neck a little bit.
You could change that a little bit either way, and which was so handy and so good. And that's one thing I used to do, before Martin ever did. But they're, they do that now, like.
But they changed really late. Wasn't it like the 80s or 90s before they changed?
I think it's the 80s before they put adjustable necks in them.
Right.
But Gibson started doing that in 1922.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they've always had that neck rod you could tighten, and I always thought that was a great idea. Just from being a builder, you like you say, you don't want to have to fix stuff.
Right, and when you can't always control the climate that the instrument's going to be in.
No,
either.
for sure.
And Martin, they actually used different materials for their truss rods for a while. Weren't some wooden and some were metal?
Well, in 1934 they started making them out of metal, just steel, and it was shaped like a T. You looked like at the end of the thing it was a T, and it was really a good neck brace, but it added some weight to it, but didn't seem to hurt anything. Those old guitars still among the best sounding ones of any of them.
Right.
I can't imagine that hurts them much, but those necks stay really stable and straight. And they did that till World War II, when that came along, it was hard to get metal.
Metal, right.
And at that time, they started making that neck rod out of a piece of ebony, which is a material, the fingerboard and bridge is made out of. It's really a dense, hard wood.
Okay.
And they made a piece like 3/8 by 3/8 big and put it through the neck, and that holds up pretty good.
Yeah.
I have a few of those old guitars that's got that neck rod in it, and they still play good, and that held up pretty good.
And those are specific to World War II then?
Yeah, that's right. During that time, it's the only time I know that they did that.
Did they go back to the metal after World War II then?
Yeah, when they got so they could get the metal, they went back to what they call a T-bar.
And you said the bracing changed in 44?
Yeah, 1944, they started making heavier braces. And those guitars still sound good too.
Yeah.
Even with bigger braces, you'd think, well, it's a drastic difference in there. That those old guitars they call scallop braces. It's shaped like maybe you think about the Golden Gate Bridge or something. They've got these scalloped arches in them.
Right.
And those braces are scalloped out like that with a thin place right in the middle of them where it lets it vibrate its ultimate most. But when they started making bigger ones, those guitars, some of those guitars sound fantastic too. Made all during the later 40s and 50s and all that. Like I say, your favorite stuff is the old ones that they built, constructed light and everything. But that when they started building bigger braces in there, they probably did hold up a lot better.
Right.
And that time people were playing bluegrass music, and
putting heavy strings on them, right?
Putting on the heaviest strings they could get to get the most sound. And people and the rhythm guitar player, which was lots of times the singer too,
right?
In a bluegrass band, played real hard, and he had this. They only had usually one guitar. Perfect bluegrass band's got a fiddle, banjo, and guitar, and mandolin, and all that stuff, and most of the time it just had that one guitar player.
Right.
If you look at pictures and old videos and stuff of Bill Monroe's band, a lot of those guitar players had beat up guitars.
Oh yeah.
And, the not much finish left on the front of them.
Oh yeah.
And I think they had to play hard to be heard.
Be heard, right.
And I can't remember seeing too many of them in person, just a few. But people like Carter Stanley and Red Smiley, all those guys, they played that guitar very hard.
Oh, yeah. And, Larry Sparks is he's still playing hard these days.
Yeah. When you're the rhythm player in a bluegrass band,
you're the drum kit.
Yeah. you're the deal when it comes to the rhythm, and you have to play hard. Nowadays, everybody's got good microphones and stuff.
Right, and pickups, right.
That's not as much as it used to be, but in those old days, you can see those rhythm guitar players play. They were hard on guitars.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised somebody like Lester Flatt could get as much power out of using. Because he just played with The thumb pick.
Yeah,
and his
just that
fingers,
thumb pick.
you know?
That's and a lot of Bill Monroe's rhythm guitar players, Carter
that way?
Stanley and Ed Mayfield. A lot of those old players that he had were thumb pickers.
Yeah.
But that was a more common thing.
Yeah.
Back in the old days, and even like when I first started playing, Mr. Ball. That's how come I play with a thumb pick like I do. He influenced me to do that and said, because he's the only guitar player I knew at the time. And he said all good guitar players use a thumb pick. And the only ones that I'd ever heard at that time, and after I knew what they were doing, was Maybelle Carter, and Chet Atkins and Merle Travis. And him, every last one of them used a thumb pick.
That's right.
So I thought he must be right, And it wasn't back at that time. I'd never heard Doc and know what could be done with a flat pick, or Django Reinhardt. He's one that was recording way back in,
Yeah.
He was a flat picker, too.
Right.
He didn't have many fingers on one hand, but whatever he had, he sure could use them.
He was using them.
Yeah.
Now, when you build your guitars and you do scallop bracing on your guitars,
yeah, just about almost always.
Is that a dynamic process, or do you have like a template that you use, or do you tune the instrument specific to the braces and the woods that you're using? Each one's going to be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, your back and sides resonates to a certain pitch, too, and you sort of try to match your top to that.
Yeah.
And I used to always, when I'm in the process of shaving those braces, scalloping them out, get them on there, and you real carefully listen. You hold that thing up and tap it. Mm-hmm. And I used to, my main process of doing that, I'd put those braces on there and keep shaving them till I thought they had the right tone.
Right.
And the worst thing you could do is get them too little. You can always shave some more off.
Can't put it back.
It's hard to put back unless you take it off and glue a new brace on the start. And that's a lot of trouble.
Right.
And what I used to always do, I'd tap it till I could. I used to could hear better too. Mm-hmm. When you get old, that stuff loses you some. But anyway, when I tap on that, if you could hear it getting a little bit toward the muddy side, I would always do that tapping and shaping before I put a bridge plate on it.
Right.
The little thin piece that sits right under the bridge.
Yeah.
It's a piece of maple that don't weigh a lot, but it has pretty big effect on it. Mm-hmm. And if I could get to where I detected that thing is as good as it's going to get, and it starts a little bit the other way, then you glue that bridge plate on, and it always brings it back to right where it was.
Stiffens it back up a little bit. Yeah.
And so you've got it right.
Yeah.
And my daughter, you was talking to a while ago, when she had, that's something, talk about her influencing me some.
Right.
I was trying to teach her, and she's not a musician or a player.
Right.
I was trying to teach her how to do that, to make the braces shave to where the tone is just right, and listen to it. And she didn't know what I was talking about. When you hold that every piece of wood in that thing's got ring and tone. Sounds like a string. It'll actually works, and you listen to it. The tone and tap tone. And she didn't know exactly what I was talking about. And she said, "Why don't you put a tuner on it?" And I thought that'd be pretty cool. And we put one on there, and sure enough, it reads out exactly what you got.
Really?
And so we learned how to. She'd say, "Well, what you tune it to?" And I'd say something in the middle. A D. Tune it A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the chords.
Right.
And that's D, C, a C sharp D, somewhere along there would be in the middle of the thing. Should be go this way or the other way,
Right.
And when we got that thing tuned in that middle chord, those braces looked just like I'd always done them.
Really?
Looked the right size, and they looked the size of the old Martins, and all that stuff. And so she's always done her, and I do it too myself now. And I clamp the tuner in the same place every time.
Right.
If you move it around, you'd get different
tones.
But you just have to settle on something that you're used to doing, and where it does the same thing every time.
Right.
And so that was really a cool thing, and it makes it. I think the reason she gets her guitars to sound really good without making them for 50 years, you know.
Right.
And
bringing that little piece of technology into like just make it more efficient.
Yeah, I think that was a good lick, and she gets her guitars sound good, and I check mine every once in a while doing that too. Yeah. Even though it's the way I've always done, and do the same shape every time.
Explain to us a little bit about, for people that are just casually interested in guitars, tell us about the Martin naming convention, because I know that all the numbers and letters confuse a lot of people when we start throwing numbers around, like 00, 000, D, J, I think they even have. So tell us a little bit about that, and I think you alluded a little bit when we were talking about inlay and stuff like that, and what the other number means. So tell us a little bit about the naming convention.
That's Martin has always had those numbers, which is a cool thing. Mm-hmm. I've never done that too much myself because I don't want to copy their thing, and they'd probably get after you anyway.
Right,
but, But something you really don't want to do is copy somebody else's thing. But if you call them, like somebody asked me about a guitar, I said, I'll make you a D28, and because I know they know what a Martin is, you know? But I don't put it in my guitar, or the only thing you ever do is just talk about it, you know? And I don't have any of those numbers in my guitars. I've thought about it at times, and but I've got my own little bridge and peghead shape, so if you see my guitar, you know it's
distinctive,
one of mine. And that's hard to come up with that enough just itself, but to have different styles.
Right.
And, most people, it's pretty much a personal thing anyway. Somebody asked me for a guitar. Well, I want one made out of rosewood and a D size or a triple aught size or whatever. And I say, well, it'd be compared to like a D18 or D28 or triple aught 45 or whatever.
Right.
I talk about their numbers because people knows what you're talking about when you say that.
And what do the numbers mean? That's like the trim level of the guitar. Is that correct?
Said I want one of those big ones, that's got that high number of 28 or 45. And I said, well, now that's a different thing. That's their system. They do that. That first numbers or letter or whatever is the size of it, like a single aught, and they all the way back. That I have a real old one from 1800. It's a size 2.
And actually, the higher the number, the smaller the guitar. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, as far as those zeros go, till they get to a D. Now that was the biggest one.
Martin
had a time convincing themselves to ever make a guitar that big.
Yeah.
And they even called it a D. That D stands for the word dreadnought, and that was a German battleship, or something, or some kind of battleship,
right?
And they thought it was so big it ought to be named after a big old ship. But then turned out to be so popular, over the years. But that's true. A single aught is little, double aught's a little bit bigger, triple aught's a little bigger, and a D, and the stuff, and a 1 and a 2 there's even smaller guitars.
And there's a 5 too, isn't there?
A number 5.
Yeah.
Is I don't know where that would have come from, to call it that. But I guess when you have catalogs in a company and people have to order your instrument stuff, they got to have some kind of a description of what it is.
Yeah, it's very specific, right?
Like almost anybody that orders a guitar from me talks to me,
Right.
So well, I want one like a, sort of like a D18 or something like that. And I said, well, I'll build you that, But I just don't put that in it,
Right.
I've wondered about that. And I think if you have a catalog you put out and like a true business like it, I think you have to do stuff like that. Because other guitars, Gibsons have J50s and J45s. And that J usually means something. It stands for jumbo in their case.
Right.
And that means a big guitar, And
they were making
LG and stuff like that was their little guitars.
They were making big guitars before Martin, weren't they? The Gibson
I'd
company?
say they probably were, especially big ones.
Yeah.
The J200 was, that's a great big old guitar. They made them back in the 30s.
Yeah.
37, long there, and that's bigger than a D-size Martin.
Right.
And but I think all that stuff came along at the same time for all of them.
Right.
Martin thought, that D-size guitar was a monstrosity and nobody would ever buy a thing like that,
I guess they were proved wrong.
And the first ones they made for a company called Ditson, Oliver Ditson Company, and they didn't even put their names on them.
Really?
And they didn't I don't think he put their actual name on one of those D-size guitars till 1931.
31 is the earliest D-size?
I think so. I think that's the first guitar that was designated the D28.
And then the trim levels go from, what's the lowest number? 15? Is that the lowest number?
Yeah, like 15's almost nothing. They just glue them together. And
no binding. They're typically all mahogany guitars, right?
Yeah, all mahogany and no binding, nothing. And,
right.
And 17s were the same thing, but had a little trim of wood binding around the top. And then 18s, which is very common. Everybody knows what a D18 or an 18 style. And they had binding on the back and top and back and a few little inlay lines on the top. And some, that kind of thing. And usually made out of wood, out of mahogany wood. And then when they got up to 21 or 28, they were made out of rosewood.
Right.
And then they get higher numbers, a 42 and 45 had pearl on them.
Right.
Had fancy stuff and went to a lot of work and time to do all that inlaying and work on them.
Let's talk a little bit about the Jimmy Rogers guitar. And I think we already talked a little bit about it. 1928, 0045. So that would be a valuable guitar, even if Jimmy Rogers hadn't owned it. Is that correct?
That's a super valuable guitar. I have Martin books. I could look and see how many they made, but I can't remember now, but not many.
Right.
Like a guitar like that was fancy and expensive back in those days. And that, even 1928, I can't remember for sure, but it's probably just $100 and some that thing cost.
Wow, yeah.
And now a triple op, 45 from 1928 or late 20s, it's probably a couple of $100,000,
wow.
Even if it's not his,
Right.
And that was, at that time, the biggest thing they made, biggest, fanciest guitar they could make at that time.
So the Triple O was the biggest guitar you could get in 1928?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. They hadn't made D's yet.
Right.
And the first fancy D one was another, star person, a Gene Autry.
Right.
He liked it. He had one real similar to, Gene Autry was a Jimmy Rogers fan.
Oh, yeah.
And, he did his songs. And
I've heard some of those original. He sounds almost exactly like Jimmy Rogers.
He could really do it.
Yeah.
And he had a guitar just like that.
Yeah.
He had, his wasn't quite his was a double out, which is almost hard to tell by looking the difference in the size.
Right.
But he had one of those and his name inlaid in it the same way, just the same way and everything. I'm sure that's all probably influence from him.
Right.
And then Gene Autry, when he got more famous and got to doing movies and wanted to sound bigger and everything, he convinced Martin. By 1933, they were making those big guitars, like D-size.
Right.
And he convinced Martin to make him one of those big old guitars with the fancy pearl work on it.
Right.
And so that sort of accidentally came about the first D45.
Was that a slope shoulder one?
It was a slope shoulder, and I have seen that.
Yeah.
I went out on playing on a tour in California one time, and that Gene Autry Museum is out there, and that's where it is.
Yeah.
And I made a special trip to go somewhere in Los Angeles, I think it is. And sure enough, that museum is there, and the guitar was a little part of that. He's, all of his owned the Los Angeles Angels at the time, but full of baseball stuff, which I liked that too. But all kinds of, his Western cowboy stuff, pistols and every kind of gun you can imagine in there. But that guitar was sitting in a case out by itself.
Yeah.
and you could walk all the way around it and look at it.
Wow.
And I could look at it and see, could use a neck set probably, but they wasn't going to let you touch it.
Right, right.
But that's, I did get to see that guitar.
Right.
And that's probably I guess one of the most famous ones there is.
I bet, yeah. Now, did they make more of the slope shoulder 45s?
Yeah, they made the second one they made was some fellow named Jackie Moore.
Okay.
He was in the movies or famous somehow.
Yeah.
And they went back and forth a bunch on that to get that to suit him and the way he wanted and everything.
And so were those 12 fret slotted headstocks?
They were 12
also?
fret slot head guitars.
Okay.
And pearl all over them.
So those are really rare.
They're really rare. Those two, and they might have later on made maybe a couple more. In the process, those D45s of the original ones, the pre-war ones, and I guess what you call it, the original ones, they only made 91 of them.
Wow. Yeah.
And so they're pretty rare. You don't see one of them very often.
And the move from the slope to the flat shoulders, was that really just to get those extra 2 frets open?
Yeah, that's when they started making when they started making a longer neck was with the OEMs.
Okay.
Like that, and which was what they call the orchestra model.
Yeah.
And they was inspired by a banjo player.
Okay.
And a guy named Purry Bechtel was a plectrum banjo player.
Okay.
Back at the time and famous, and he talked them into making him a guitar, but he wanted one with a longer, slimmer neck that resembled his banjo a little more.
Now, if we go back to the 60s, was there a time when those Martin guitars were just considered used guitars? Like when people didn't see really the value and the artistry and how they were built?
Oh, yeah, all that stuff. That came, I don't know if, what caused all that stuff. Back in the 60s, I can remember, of course, I didn't have any money, back in those days, but if I had, those guitars were fairly cheap.
Yeah.
But, money was harder to come by, too.
Yeah.
But I can remember, a D28 herringbone from the 30s, now's over $100,000, a nice one. And I can remember a time when you could see them for $400 and $500. I used to work for Gruen's in Nashville.
Oh, did you really?
And I did. Way back when he very first started his business, I'd go down there and work for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And do his repair work for him, and then I'd come back home and do my normal thing.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to move away or anything like that. But I would go help him every once in a while, and I got to work on really nice stuff.
Yeah, I bet.
And at one time, about 1971 or sometime along there, when I worked for him, he was a collector, too, to start with. And he had 4 of those pre-war D45s. And he had one that was owned by Charlie Monroe.
Oh, wow.
And it was a nice one. Beautiful guitar. And Johnny Cash had it it's where he got it from.
Okay.
And that guitar, I'd just go crazy over it. I loved that guitar, and it was such beautiful shape.
Right.
And he said he had 4 of them, and he would sell me either one of them for $4,000.
Wow.
But $4,000 just seemed like when I drive to Nashville, I had a 66 Ford that I was very skeptical about whether it would make the trip or not, down there. And I was worried about driving that thing that far.
Right.
And that $4,000, I could have bought a brand new Corvette.
Right.
At the time. And I thought, this is crazy. I wanted that guitar so bad, and I could have worked for him and worked it out.
Oh, right.
And or if it had been smart enough, just go to the bank and get a loan. I'd pay it off whenever you could.
Right.
And I'd have had that D45. And but anyway, I passed on that, but I've kicked myself ever since for not doing that.
I don't know. I think you did all right.
Well, I've actually got one of those guitars now right behind you.
Is that here? Yeah.
But it's not in as good a shape as that one was.
Yeah.
And it's also a famous one, too.
Right.
And I just always wish I'd have done that deal somehow.
Wow.
But anyway, that kind of stuff, that's always been, I can remember when those things, and then they got to be, that same guitar now, as good a shape as that one's in. I just heard this story recently that Bob Wills, the Texas Cowboy band leader, he was a fiddler and band leader as far as I know. It matters what he did, but he had one of those things. He bought brand new in 1941.
Really?
And had never, ever played it.
Whoa.
And his family got that thing out recently and sold it. And it was in beautiful condition. They said it looked like it could have hang tags on it.
Wow.
And I think that thing brought about $650,000. And, a lot of people do those guitars for investments like the stock market and stuff.
Right.
But I don't know. Those old guitars it's amazing what they're worth nowadays. And I'm like everybody else, you can remember back in those days, if you just bought that guitar, it only cost $400 or $500.
Right.
But that $400 or $500 was
a lot of money.
Really hard for me to have, back in.
Right.
And I've done okay collecting guitars anyway, especially since I got so I could trade my own guitars for them. Right. And I've got, lots of them now, but lots of them I remember that I wish I had.
Now, when you look for a guitar, like, are you consciously adding guitars to your collection now, or?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
I just like the artwork of them.
Yeah.
They're my art collection.
Right. Exactly.
And you can also use them. You can play them and get sound out of them. And if you had a Rembrandt or whatever that is, you
just got to look at it on the wall.
It's a great thing to have. But I think the best you can do is look at it.
Right.
And,
now, do all of the guitars you have, do they see playtime?
Yeah. Most of them, probably not all of them, but most of them I eventually play on them.
Yeah.
And I don't just hang them up there
to look at.
Right. They all work and play good. And that's a, fascination to me that those old guitars still work and play. And I learn stuff from them.
And they'll be around after you're gone, too, which is like a whole other thing to think about, how it just, like that story on that mandolin is insane. I mean, but once it passes through your hands onto somebody else, somebody will know the complete story.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to collect. You collect the stories with them, too, all you can. It's not just a guitar you go buy at the store. You try to learn the history and all kinds. And these old guitars like that, all of them's got history stuff, And that's always pretty cool thing to have and know about.
Well, I think we got a lot here. So the last thing I'm going to ask is, what's the future look like? Are you still building guitars? Are you going to keep building guitars? And obviously we talked to Jane and you've passed a lot of this knowledge on, but there's more that you're going to pass on to her. And so what's the next, say, 5 years look like for you?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm getting up there now. Yeah. I'm 75 years old and probably can't do too awful much more, but I still really enjoy that more than anything else, working in my shop and building stuff. And I'm real happy that I've passed on some of that stuff to my daughter and several other people that are making guitars now. And for myself, I still enjoy that as much as I ever have, And I feel like I'm making pretty nice stuff right now. And I don't know why, anything. Maybe just for done it so long or something, but I still enjoy doing it and like to do it. Right. And you can still collect pretty nice wood. It's not just impossible to find a piece of nice red spruce or Brazilian rosewood, and you can still find that stuff, and you can still make a really equivalent instrument to the ones they did back in the 30s. Really? And if you build them the same way and got reasonably the same material, there ain't no reason. I think I make guitars and somebody talking about that thing sounding so good, and the old 30s one, because it's old in age, but I'm convinced that old 37 D28 sounded fantastic when it was brand new. Yeah. And I totally believe that. Yeah. And
I was going to ask you, do you subscribe to the idea that guitars sound better as they age?
Well, I guess they have to a little bit. Mm-hmm. wood dries out good, and but it was certainly to a certain dryness and humidity, and when that thing was built brand new, or they wouldn't have built it.
Right.
And that kind of stuff, I think, is the same then that it is now.
Right.
But I think it has something to do with that wood being vibrated.
Yeah.
They say when a piece of wood vibrates, the sound waves travel back and forth through it. That's how it works, how it operates. And those molecules in the wood line themselves up, so the more it gets vibrated and played, the easier those sound waves goes through there.
Right.
And so an old guitar that's been played and used a lot, just the notes and tone just comes out of it easier.
Right.
And I don't know whether that keeps going. I mean, I don't know that.
Right.
You know, but that probably a guitar that gets played a little bit. I know when I make a brand new guitar, string it up, and I think it sounds fantastic and all that, but it'll always sound better tomorrow.
Right.
And the better, but I don't know how much that does that, you know, from men on.
Right. And you've been building guitars long enough now to see your guitars having aged, like, because your first guitars are 50 years old now.
Yeah.
So that's a significant amount of time on those guitars. Like.
Yeah. And then some of them gets played and used a lot. And,
Right.
And they sound like old guitars, but sometimes it's pretty hard to detect that they sound much better than a brand new one, you know, even the Martins, you know, or anything. But I think most important thing is the way they were built to start with, and the good materials, and of course they're going to probably get better as older, but not that much,
right?
In my opinion.
Okay, well, I'll take your opinion as somebody that's heard a few guitars. So I guess to wrap things up, Martin has embraced over the last, I guess, in the 60s, they started making their first guitars that were kind of throwbacks to the vintage styles with the NY series and stuff that they did back then. But they've really embraced some of the vintage aspects of their construction from the past. What are your feelings on those guitars that they make now?
Well, they make some absolutely great guitars now, I think, and they're the same way that of any of us. You know, they got craft people up there that know to make that guitars that sound like those old ones and play like them and everything. They got to copy them. They got to make them. They got to copy their own stuff, that they made years ago, and they're good at it. And they do that, and they've got the custom shop that does that kind of stuff, and they've got access to good materials, and there's not a thing wrong with their new guitars. I don't think they're even other companies, anything. I think we all try to do the best job we can possibly do, and because you want people to like your work, and even a company like that, I think, does, and so they're, I like especially Martins. Their new guitars are great, and there's all kinds of smaller builders, Collins, and they make great guitars, and they do it in a really good way, and they're real particular about their materials. And there's other, there's small companies everywhere, Husson, Dalton, Virginia, and companies, small companies like that make nice stuff, And so it's there's no shortage of good guitars, I don't think. I'm not worried about them drying up.
Anytime soon?
No.
Has Martin ever contacted you to copy or look at any of your guitars?
No, not really. They've got a museum themselves, that's got almost every old guitar they ever made.
Yeah.
It's right there where they can copy it and look at it. And anything I make myself, I've probably copied from one of their other ones, and not too many inventions have I done, or anything. But,
oh, wow. Well, Wayne, I appreciate you sitting down with us and talking to us about this. Obviously I'm a guitar fan, and I never envisioned I would be able to sit down and talk like this with somebody. So.
Well, I enjoyed that. I always enjoy talking guitars, for sure. That's one of my favorite things to do. And appreciate you all taking time to hang out with me.
Yes. Thank you so much.